So I just finished writing a fairly large orchestra piece called Wayfaring Stranger. You can check that out on my channel. And today I want to show you how I built my template from the ground up using Cubase and Vienna Ensemble Pro 7. So as you can see, there are hundreds of tracks here in this template, most of which are using samples from the Berlin series by Orchestral Tools. While this is just the latest version of many templates I've built over the years, this is the first one where I finally feel like I can open up a new project and just get to work, and I don't have to worry about setting things up, and it's really streamlined my whole process. I used to host all of my samples in instances of Kontakt or Sine or the Spitfire player within my actual Cubase session. I would make new instrument tracks for each articulation that I needed, and that all worked fine for the most part. But I started noticing just how much time I was wasting loading up and saving projects in Cubase, especially when the Cubase autosave would interrupt my workflow, sometimes taking 30 or 60 seconds. Then I discovered Vienna Ensemble Pro, which can host all of your samples and connect to your DAW through the network, either on the same computer or another network computer. I'm using Vienna Ensemble Pro on the same machine as my DAW, and even still there are so many benefits to using it. Using VEP frees up resources for Cubase to run more smoothly, and saving and loading projects just takes seconds now. It's also really convenient if you want to switch between projects in your DAW, or even work with two different DAWs using the same sample library template. VEP lets you do all of that, so today I'd like to show you how I set my template up specifically to work with Cubase. So to start, I've loaded up an empty project in both Cubase and Vienna Ensemble Pro 7. You want the server and not the standalone version if you're going to connect to your DAW. I'll click this plus button to open up a new instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro. I like to create one instance for every large orchestral section, so one for woodwinds, one for brass, one for strings, for percussion. If you write for choirs, you might have one for choirs, or synthesizers even. Each instance is capable of 8 MIDI ports and 32 audio inputs and outputs. That's of course 32 mono channels of audio, so really we're dealing with 16 stereo channels for each. You can increase these numbers, but I suspect you'd run into some performance issues. I'm not sure though. You can also set the number of CPU threads dedicated to each instance. The default for mine was 2, and I haven't bothered to change that, but depending on your CPU, you might consider changing that number. And just to clarify what I mean by MIDI port, each MIDI port contains a maximum of 16 MIDI channels. Each time we want a separate instrument or articulation on its own MIDI track, that track will most likely use one of those 16 available MIDI channels. So with 8 ports, we have a total of 128 MIDI channels per instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro. That's important to keep in mind when building a large template with hundreds of articulations. Okay, so in the main window, we have our channels located on the left-hand side, and it defaults to a single master bus channel, but we'll add more channels here soon. In the middle, we have our mix window, and this is where you would add inserts, effects, route audio, and also where your instances of Kontakt and Sine and all of your players will open up. On the right hand side we have an automation window, which I'm not going to go into today, so I'm going to cancel that. So at this point, if I were to open up a new instance of Kontakt and then open up an instrument, let's say Flute 1 Legato, you'll notice that the interface here does not load properly. That's because the server version of Vienna Ensemble Pro, not the standalone, but the server, you have to make a connection to your DAW before you can see any of these interfaces load up properly, in Kontakt at least. So to do that, I'm going to find my Cubase session, and in the right panel here, under VSTI, I'm going to create a new rack instrument, and under VSL, I'll click Vienna Ensemble Pro. It'll ask if you want to create a new track. I can do that later, so I'm going to click cancel. And you want to connect and find that instance that we created. Connect this up, and here we go. Another thing you want to do is decouple this Cubase session from the Vienna Ensemble Pro. So you can do that by just clicking this button here. And this makes sure that when you save your Cubase session, Cubase then doesn't try to save your Vienna Ensemble Pro template. Okay, so now we made that connection, and we should have the correct looking interface shown here, and that looks good. All right, so when we create an instance of Kontakt, we also see that instance in the mix window. Right now it's routed to the master bus channel, which is itself routed to outputs 1 and 2. So outputs 1 and 2 correspond to the first 2 available channels from the 32 total channels available in this instance. And those channels show up here in our DAW when we create the Vienna Ensemble Pro instrument. So in a bit, I'll show you how to activate more of these audio channels, but for now we just have the first stereo channel. And if we add a MIDI track and route this to the correct port and channel, we should be able to hear a sound. So that seems to be working correctly. Something to keep in mind here, right now this is being routed to the master bus. We don't need to do that, so we can in fact just route this directly to 1 and 2. So because I'll be adding multiple instruments or patches into this one instance of Kontakt so that I can minimize the total number of Kontakt instances I have throughout this template, I'm going to want to change this to all so that all MIDI channels can be routed through this instance. So before I add more instruments here, I want to mention that I first came up with a game plan for my template in this spreadsheet. So I knew that I'd be limited to 8 MIDI ports, and within each port 16 MIDI channels. As I said earlier, I'm building this template around the Berlin series by Orchestral Tools, and one of the things that I love most about this collection is that there are individual players recorded for each woodwind and brass instrument. So we have flute 1, flute 2, flute 3, as opposed to just having a solo flute patch and a 3 flutes patch. Because I'm writing a lot of concert music, I like having my template look more like an orchestral score. But because of that, I'm going to have a lot more MIDI tracks. So part of this spreadsheet was figuring out how to divide articulations into MIDI tracks. I knew that I wanted to separate longs and shorts, but I also wanted to separate any articulations that I may at some point want to layer over each other in the music. Not to mention being able to set different negative track delay times for certain articulations. In the end, this is what I came up with. In terms of audio routing, I have all of the flutes going to one of 2 stereo outputs, with the long articulations routed to outputs 1 and 2, and the short articulations routed to 3 and 4. I do it this way so that I can apply different amounts of reverb to longs and shorts, but you may find that this is unnecessary. Some of you may even find that combining all of the woodwinds into just 2 stereo outputs is sufficient. So right now we have just 1 stereo output available in this instance of Kontakt, and depending on how you want to set your Kontakt instance up, you may need 2 or more stereo outputs in one instance. And so for the flutes, I just need 2. I need 1 for shorts and 1 for longs. So you have to make sure that your outputs tab is visible. And right now I just have 1 stereo out, like I said. So I want to click this plus and add a new stereo output. So 1 stereo output channel. And here I can just select the first available, this auxiliary channel. Click OK. And here we go. Now we have 1 and 2. Now, these outputs in Kontakt are not the same as these outputs. So these outputs are for the instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro. So we've got 32 available. These are basically localized to your instance of Kontakt that you're working with. And so each time we have a new instance of Kontakt, we'll be dealing with new output channels available. So now that I have two stereo outputs, I'm going to label these flutes long and flutes short. And I can route this instrument correctly to flute long. For my second instrument, I want to create a multi-articulation patch of flute 1, and I'm going to combine staccatissimo and staccato into one patch. So I'm going to control that later on using expression mappings. And so I want to route this to flute short. So I created a MIDI track in Cubase for my flute 1 shorts, and so we have to set up the audio routing correctly. First, within Vienna Ensemble Pro, we have to make sure that this is in fact checked to all, which it is. And then we go to the mix window and create an additional output for this instance of Kontakt. So to do that, click that plus. That basically creates an auxiliary channel, and you can route that separately to your DAW. And so I'm going to set this output to 3 and 4. And these outputs correspond to the outputs shown in Cubase. So this would be 3 and 4. And to clean this up, I like to label these channels accordingly. So flutes long and flutes short. So we have flutes long going to 1 and 2, and flutes short going to 3 and 4. And that's exactly what I had in my spreadsheet template. This still, however, won't do anything, so we have to activate the correct output in Cubase. Now this should work. Good. So I've gone ahead and filled out this first instance of Kontakt with all of the flute and piccolo samples that I'll need. You can see here I'm at MIDI channel 16, so I've run out of room. So what happens if I try to add the next patch from my template into this instance? That would be the alto flute legato. So no free instrument slots available. We can go to this slot here and try again. So it loads, but it defaults to the B port, which is inaccessible in anything other than the standalone version of Kontakt. So what I need to do is create a new instance of Kontakt, which will give me a fresh 16 MIDI channels to work with. So now I'm going to have to change this to MIDI input or port 2. And of course make sure that this is checked to all. So to continue, let's take a look at our template spreadsheet. So now we're on MIDI port 2, and we've got the alto flutes and the oboes and English horn. So the alto flute will be routed to the same outputs as the other flutes, but the oboes will have their own output. So that means we need a total of 4 stereo output channels in this instance of Kontakt. So we need to add 3 more stereo outputs, just using the same process I showed before. So now we have 4 total audio channels, and I'm just going to label these accordingly. So now I'll head over to the mix window, and I'm going to add 3 additional stereo aux channels. So now I just have to make sure that these aux channels are routed correctly. So alto flute long should go to 1 and 2, shorts should go to 3 and 4, oboes long should go to 5 and 6, and oboes short 7 and 8. So that should match my template. Okay, so I'm just going to fill out this instance of Kontakt with the alto flute and oboe samples that I need. Okay, so I've added some alto flute patches as well as the first two oboe 1 patches, oboe 1 legato and oboe 1 shorts. Routed the legato to oboe longs and the shorts patch to the oboe short output. So now if I go over to Cubase and add a MIDI track, remember that the previous MIDI track that I used was the piccolo, it was channel 16 of that first MIDI port. So if I add a new MIDI track now, Cubase will default this to MIDI port 1, but we'll start over at MIDI channel 1. I want it to be port 2. So now if I add a few more MIDI tracks, these should all be the correct MIDI channel and MIDI port. So I'll go ahead and see if these are routed correctly. Looks good. But the oboes are not coming through because we have not yet activated the audio outputs in Cubase here. So I'll activate outputs 5, 6, and 7 and 8. So now to check if these are routed properly. Okay, so that's all good. So the other sample engine that I'll be using is the Sine player, and that includes the solo woodwinds as well as several string libraries. It's set up somewhat similarly to Kontakt. We have the MIDI channel here and all of our articulations and the key switches. If I go to the mix window, it shows me my available microphone positions. I've only downloaded the first spot mic for this library. Here we can route each microphone separately, which is really convenient. It's honestly a little bit more intuitive to work in Sine than it is in Kontakt. So I, for one, am looking forward to Orchestral Tools porting their libraries to the Sine player in the near future. Okay, so I have finished making my template in both Vienna Ensemble Pro and in Cubase. And now each of these MIDI tracks are being routed to the correct instance of Vienna Ensemble Pro through the correct port and through the correct MIDI channel. And so then all of the samples in Vienna Ensemble Pro are being routed through audio to the correct output in Cubase. So now I have 4 instances of Vienna Ensemble Pro. And in each instance, I have those instruments organized into folders, and every instrument is color-coded, and the color scheme sort of matches the scheme that I came up with in Cubase. So to do that, you select a track and go to Channel and change color. And in Cubase, you can find the project color setup menu, and you can pick individual colors and label them. And when you want to change the color of a track or several tracks, you select this menu and choose from all of the colors. So real quick, I'll show you how I'm routing audio within Cubase. So all of these audio tracks that came from Vienna Ensemble Pro are being routed to a specific group track down here. So for instance, the flute long and flute short tracks are being routed to the same flute bus. It's called a group track in Cubase. And then that flute group track is then being routed to the woodwind bus, which is routed to the mix bus. So I know this looks a little bit convoluted, but I do it this way so that first I can apply different amounts of reverb to the short and long articulations, and then I want to group those two channels together so that I can apply process into all of the flutes together. And then flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons are all going to the woodwind bus where I can apply further processing, or more importantly, balance the woodwind section against the rest of the orchestra. Okay, so the last thing that I want to demonstrate today is how personally I deal with key switches and switching between articulations that are within the same MIDI track. So up until recently, I would have each articulation on its own MIDI track, and it made certain things very easy, like switching between tracks, and you'd instantly get the articulation that you wanted. But there were just so many tracks in my template, and of course using Vienna Ensemble Pro, you're somewhat limited in the total number of MIDI tracks or MIDI channels. So that's one of the reasons why I'm using more multi-articulation patches in Kontakt. So when you create a multi-articulation patch in Kontakt, it automatically maps those articulations to key switches, usually starting at MIDI note C0. So right now staccatissimo is C0 and staccato is C#0. So I can find those key switches on my MIDI controller and trigger those articulation changes. So I've always found that trying to coordinate my left hand and my right hand key switches and playing music to be very difficult. And if you have a undersized piano or MIDI controller, it can be just impossible. So obviously another way to do this would be to go into the MIDI data and just pencil in the key switches when you need them. So this method's fine, of course, but I find it to be a little tedious if you have to constantly scroll down to find the right MIDI trigger note. My new preferred method for handling all of these articulation changes is using expression maps in Cubase. So to create an expression map for a specific track, you select that track and go to create expression map here, and you can see now all of the expression maps that I've had to create for the Berlin series. And many of these I can use for multiple tracks, for instance, any of these that are staccatissimo and staccato, but there are many that are just unique to certain instruments. So here I'll demonstrate how to create a new one. You can click this plus button and give the expression map a name. And then you have your sound slots here where you add your articulations. So I'm going to go ahead and label these. So then you can set up your remotes for Cubase. So I'll just use the key switches, C0 and C#0. So then over here is what information Cubase sends to the actual instrument. So it'll be the same for me, C0 and C#0. You can actually make this use channel information or velocity changes. A lot of different ways to set this up. But for my needs, I am sticking with the key switches. So then the next thing you want to do is add an articulation to each. And there are some predefined ones. And so I'll just do that for staccatissimo and staccato. If you can't find the articulation that you need from these predefined lists, you can, of course, add a custom articulation. And then you can either use a symbol from this predefined list of symbols or just write some text. So for instance, a lot of these portatos and espressivos, I have to write in a short string of words or letters. So there are two different types of articulations in these expression maps, attributes and directions. So I'll show you how to use both of those. So once you've created an expression map and then applied that map to your track, it's really easy to go in here to the MIDI data and change any of these notes to a new articulation. Because I used attributes instead of directions for this expression map, it's really easy to just select a note and find the articulations menu here to change that articulation. So if I change this expression map to use directions as opposed to attributes, I can then designate a direction change in this articulation and dynamics automation lane. And all of the following MIDI notes will be staccatissimo now, or at least until I make a new direction change. So there's some good reasons to use one or the other. I tend to use attributes simply because I like having this articulations window here. If you use directions, that is not, it doesn't do anything. So I think that's all I want to cover in this video. At this point, I've got my template up and running, and I'm ready to start writing music. Once again, I strongly recommend checking out Vienna Ensemble Pro 7. It's already saved me so much time when working on large projects, and at this point I couldn't imagine not using it. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and please like and subscribe to my channel for future videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.